Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's session of the Berkeley Forum. My name is Aparna Iyer. I'm currently the president, and we're so excited to welcome you to this event. Before we begin, I encourage the audience to please fill out the attendance form at tinyurl.com/Elmendorf-attendance and to submit questions for the moderator to read aloud at tinyurl.com/Elmendorf-questions. Before introducing our speaker, the Berkeley Forum would like to take the time to acknowledge that our events and UC Berkeley's campus do sit on the territory of the Ohlone people and that we benefit from the continued use and occupation of this land. It's important to us to acknowledge this out of respect to the Muwekma Ohlone people who are still present in the Bay Area and in Berkeley today. If you're looking for more resources on Native education on campus, we encourage you to look to the Centers for Educational Justice and Community Engagement. And with that, I'd like to invite up the event manager for tonight's event, Wendy, to introduce our speaker.
Tonight's speaker, Doug Elmendorf, is the Dean and Don K. Price Professor of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. As an American economist, he has worked on the federal budget, macroeconomic fiscal policy, social security programs, forecasting financial markets, and a range of other topics throughout his career in public service and academia. Prior to his leadership at Harvard Kennedy School, he serves as the director of the Congressional Budget Office from 2009 to 2015, where he played a critical role in healthcare reforms during the Obama administration. He has held positions in other notable institutions, including Brookings Institution, White House Council of Economic Advisors, and the Federal Reserve Board. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dean Elmendorf to the virtual stage.
Hello, and thank you for that kind introduction. I am delighted to be here with you today at the Berkeley Forum. The United States is suffering from a collection of crises, including an economic crisis. Our current national situation has been described as what healthcare providers call an acute on chronic condition. That is a condition in which a patient has unresolved chronic health problems and then experiences an acute health problem that is worse because of the underlying chronic problems. In the United States today, we have an acute on chronic condition. We have acute crises in our health and well-being, our democracy and governance, our economy, and more. And these acute crises are worse because they come on top of chronic problems with our health, our democracy, and our economy. I do not mean to be discouraging. As serious as these problems are, we know ways to address them. And many people of knowledge and goodwill are eager to make a positive difference. I hope that you are among those people. So we have a lot of work to do, and we should get at it. I want to spend the next 20 minutes or so offering ideas for generating an economic recovery that responds to both our acute health crisis and our chronic economic problems. These ideas are based on my values and on my reading of the evidence about how public policies affect the economy and people's lives. And I look forward, when I finish, to hearing your questions and comments. In my view, there are three key requirements for moving toward a full economic recovery in this country. First, we need to provide economic relief and stimulus until the pandemic has truly eased. Second, we need to empower people to find good work that pays enough to support themselves and their families. And third, we need to strengthen the safety net for people who aren't working. Let me take each of these pieces in turn. First, economic relief and stimulus are needed to limit the human and economic toll of the pandemic. About 10 million fewer people are working in this country today than a year ago. And we're putting people back to work at only a slow pace. With lost incomes, people are behind on their rent, staying in their homes so far, in some cases, only through the flexibility of their landlords and moratoriums on evictions. Demand at food banks is notably higher than usual. Now, on the bright side, vaccinations against COVID are starting to take hold. That increases hope that we will return to many more in-person interactions by the middle of the year. But the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel is still a long way off. And even if we increase the vaccination rate above its current 1.5 million people or so per day, many Americans may still be unvaccinated by the summer. And the spread of new variants of COVID presents new risks. Therefore, national economic policymakers should provide both relief and stimulus. You may have heard these terms being used. By relief, I mean support for struggling families, businesses, and state and local governments. By stimulus, I mean a boost to overall spending, which would increase businesses' sales and then their demand for workers. Now, many types of policies would provide both relief and stimulus, including payments to households, more loans to businesses, and grants to state and local governments. There's an important debate underway in the papers every day about how much additional relief and stimulus should be provided. The federal government has already enacted significantly more relief and stimulus than it did in the wake of the financial crisis and Great Recession a dozen years ago. And that's very welcome. In 2008 through 10, federal fiscal policy provided a vitally important boost to economic activity. But then in 2011 and later, that fiscal support turned into fiscal restraint. That slowed the economic recovery, kept more people unemployed for longer than would have been the case if fiscal policy had remained supportive. And that premature tightening of fiscal policy was one of the most significant mistakes in economic policy in the past half century. It's very good and important that we're not repeating that now. But saying that we should go big doesn't tell us how big we should go. President Biden and congressional Democrats have proposed a package of spending increases and tax reductions totaling $1.9 trillion. My own assessment is that a smaller amount would be sufficient, maybe $1 trillion of spending increases or tax reductions. And there are many economists who think that even smaller amounts than $1 trillion would be appropriate. I think the Democrats want to go bigger for two reasons. One is that they want to provide a bigger boost to people's incomes than is needed just to counteract the pandemic. They have other goals in mind, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The other reason I think they want to go bigger is that we don't actually know how much relief and stimulus will be needed to counteract the pandemic. And the risks of doing too much are a lot smaller than the risk of doing too little. Let me explain that now. There are a number of reasons why the risks are asymmetric. The first is the Federal Reserve can offset an economy that gets too strong by raising interest rates. But it can't readily offset an economy that's too weak by cutting interest rates because rates are already so low. So the Federal Reserve's ability to use monetary policy to move the economy is itself asymmetric. With interest rates so low, the Fed can slow the economy by raising rates, but can't spur it by cutting rates. Therefore, fiscal policy needs to do more. That's an argument for erring on the side of larger relief and stimulus. The second reason why the risks are asymmetric is that the human and social costs of excess unemployment are very high. Recessions are harmful not really because they cause a small decrease in everyone's incomes, but because they cause very large drops in some people's incomes. So providing enough relief and stimulus to get everybody back to work, reach as many people as possible, is important. Third factor is that the federal budget situation is not a significant constraint now. Federal debt is historically high relative to the size of the economy, but interest rates are very low now and are expected to stay low for many years. So the budgetary consequences of having a big fiscal package, doing a lot of relief and stimulus, the budgetary consequences aren't as bad as people would have thought at different points in the past. Again, that's the reason why one could err on the larger side rather than the smaller side in the fiscal package that happens now. I should add here that we could avoid having to guess how much relief and stimulus are needed if fiscal policymakers could move more nimbly, but they don't really do that, or if we establish triggers for relief and stimulus based on the unemployment rate or some other measure of economic conditions. Indeed, a number of economists, including me and my colleague Karen Dynan, had done research about ways to establish triggers. And we could write them into law today. But policymakers have not jumped on those ideas, and they've not demonstrated fast reactions to economic conditions during the past 6 months. So instead, I think as a practical matter, we do have to guess about how large a fiscal package we need. So that's the first piece of this economic recovery package, which is a big support, relief and stimulus now. The second big piece of generating an economic recovery that responds to both our acute economic crisis and our chronic economic problems is to empower people to find good work that pays enough to support themselves and their families. This is hard but crucially important. Living standards for lower and middle income Americans have improved only slightly on average during the past few decades. It is challenging to measure household incomes well, but the data show pretty clearly that market incomes of people across most of the income distribution have increased fairly little in recent decades, while market incomes of people at the top of the distribution have risen considerably. And in particular, Americans who have less education or living in certain parts of our country have had much less economic opportunity and much less improvement in their standard of living than Americans who have more education or living in other parts of the country. We have, as you know, a tax and transfer system that mutes this divergence in market incomes a little, but doesn't reduce it very much. According to the latest data from the Congressional Budget Office, where I used to work, the top 1/5 of the distribution, so the top quintile, top 20% of people or households, receive 55% of income before accounting for taxes and transfer payments, and 49% of income after including taxes and transfer payments. So not as high as 55%, but only down to 49%, not that much different. So adding to concerns about what has happened in the past, some people are worried, appropriately, that economic forces will make these problems worse over time. Over the coming decades, expanding use of self-driving vehicles, the diffusion of artificial intelligence, and other technological changes will probably eliminate a significant number of jobs that currently tend to be held by people without college degrees. And whether other forces will create more jobs for people without college degrees, and what those jobs will be like, are important questions. This shortage of economic opportunity for many Americans has had a range of economic and social consequences, negative economic and social consequences. For example, the labor force participation rate for men without college degrees, that is the percentage of men without college degrees who are working or looking for work, has fallen sharply relative to the participation rate for men with college degrees. Another example, Americans of my age in the top part of the income distribution are expected to live significantly longer than our parents on average. But Americans of my age in the bottom third of the income distribution are expected to live no longer than their parents on average. Another example, some communities have been devastated by a loss of jobs stemming from technological change and growing imports. And the destruction of those communities and their social fabric has had profound social costs as well as economic costs. And a further example, the growing divergence of income and wealth has significant damaging consequences for our political system, as some people's perspectives end up receiving disproportionate weight in our policy choices, and as other people whose voices don't have much weight lose confidence that the system is responsive to their needs. So to address all these challenges, we need to focus our economic policy on improving standards of living for lower and middle income Americans, rather than boosting total income or GDP. And these goals of boosting the overall size of the pie and making sure that people who had smaller slices get somewhat bigger slices, those goals are sometimes aligned, but not always. And when there are trade-offs between them, I think we should reject policies that would boost overall income, but hurt living standards for the less well-off. And we should support policies that could diminish total income if they're boosting living standards for the less well-off. So this focus will lead us to a number of important policy steps. First, we should improve education and training for people who did not have good access to education and training today. That means more support for early childhood programs, for community colleges, and for job training. Broadening access to education and training would help empower more people to be effective in well-paying jobs. A second policy is to improve jobs that are often held by people with less education and training, so that those jobs become more rewarding and offer greater avenues for advancement. So think here about building expanded career ladders, say, so that the most junior people working in nursing homes can advance to more senior roles, and providing access to benefits that you can keep with you even if you move between jobs, rather than sticking with one employer for a long time. A third policy that would help lower middle income Americans, in my view, is to raise the minimum wage. Raising the minimum wage would probably cause some job loss, but would raise incomes substantially for a much larger number of people. After adjusting for inflation, the minimum wage is lower today than at many times over the past decades, and I think we should raise it. Fourth, we should work to reduce systemic bias against people because of their race and ethnicity, their gender, their sexual orientation, their religion, or other characteristics. Giving everyone a fair opportunity to thrive in our society is a matter of basic justice, of human rights. It is also imperative to national economic success. Fifth policy, we should increase public investment in infrastructure like transportation infrastructure and water infrastructure. Public infrastructure investment can be good for the society as a whole, but is often especially important for the well-being of lower and middle income people, because they are often less able to use private substitutes for public services. Think, for example, about who's most dependent on bus routes and the public water supply. And sixth, we should run a high-pressure economy, by which I mean an economy in which the demand for workers is very strong. I spoke about this a few years ago across the bay from Berkeley at a conference at the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. Picture a job market that is a pot of water bubbling vigorously. That's what a high-pressure economy means. When the unemployment rate falls low, then employers work really hard to find workers. And that tends to boost their efforts. It means they do more training, offer more opportunities, offer higher wages. And we saw this when the unemployment rate fell so low before the pandemic. So when we get beyond the pandemic, we should use monetary policy and fiscal policy to keep the economy close to full employment. So this is a menu I've offered, a menu of policies, each of which can make some difference and collectively can make more difference into helping Americans find jobs that have compensation that lets them support themselves and their families. We have not been pursuing those policies very effectively at all for the last several years. In some cases, we've been moving in exactly the wrong direction, but we can do a lot better. We can make the investments that we should make in education and infrastructure. We can include people rather than excluding them from the opportunities to thrive in our society. We can do those things, and we should. Then the third big piece of generating economic recovery that responds to both our acute economic crisis and our chronic economic problems is to strengthen the safety net for people who are not working. For many people, work provides dignity and purpose as well as income, and it's crucially important that our public policies encourage and reward work, as I've just discussed. At the same time, many people are unable to work. Some are older and can't continue to do the physically demanding jobs they did earlier in their lives. Some are physically or mentally disadvantaged in some way, and they are unable to find an appropriate job. Some people are caring for older or younger family members, so they can't hold down a paid job as well. And some lost jobs when the economy turned down or a key business left their town and new jobs aren't available. I think we have a moral responsibility to provide a minimum standard of living for people who are unable to work for the reasons I mentioned. Unfortunately, if we gave more public support to everyone who is not working, we would enable some people who could work but would rather not to quit their jobs. But I do not think that problem should deter us from providing a minimum standard of living for everyone. And two considerations beyond the crucial moral considerations are important to my thinking. One is that the federal budgetary cost of providing a minimum standard of living for everyone is not very large relative to the budgetary costs we are currently bearing of providing retirement and health benefits for Americans over the age of 65. For example, the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare, increased the number of Americans with health insurance by more than 20 million, which is a huge boon to them. To accomplish this goal, the Affordable Care Act increased federal spending on healthcare subsidies. But those new subsidies represent less than 10% of total federal spending on healthcare today. Almost all of that federal spending actually goes to support care for Americans who are over the age of 65 or are officially deemed to be disabled. And so the cost of expanding the safety net to provide health insurance for 20 million additional Americans through the Affordable Care Act was actually pretty small relative to what the federal government was already spending on healthcare. And the cost of expanding the Affordable Care Act further to cover the remaining people who are uninsured would not be very expensive by the same lights. And that's true in a number of areas of federal policy. We could make a big difference for amounts that are large in dollar terms, but not very large relative to what the federal government is already committed to spend. The other consideration that enters my thinking is that providing support for working age adults would be good for their children as well as for the adults themselves, and good for their children not just today, but in the future. A common argument for limiting public support for people who are not working is concern that social welfare programs could encourage habits, like not working, that make the children of recipients worse off later in their lives. But actually, there's a growing body of evidence that the opposite is true. Children in families that receive public benefits have better, longer-term outcomes in the labor market themselves in their lives than children in similar families that don't receive public benefits. So given the moral imperative, the fairly low budgetary cost, and the positive effect on poor children when they grow up, I think we should strengthen the safety net to provide more support for people who don't work. This strengthening includes, for example, expanding the child tax credit, which is part of the Democratic relief and stimulus bill and has been endorsed in various other forms by a number of Republican lawmakers. So let me wrap up. We have the policy tools to generate an economic recovery that responds to both our acute economic crisis and our chronic economic problems. Based on my values and my reading of the evidence, I think the crucial pieces are first, economic relief and stimulus until the pandemic has truly eased. Second, empowering people to find good work that pays enough to support themselves and their families. And third, strengthening the safety net for people who aren't working. I hope you found my discussion of these policies to be illuminating and perhaps persuasive, but mostly I hope that you are committed enough to making a better country, that you keep thinking about these issues, learning what you can, coming to the conclusions that seem right to you, and then participating vigorously in the political process on behalf of your views. Democracy only works if people are informed and engaged. Our country needs you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dean Elmendorf, for that address. It's now my pleasure to invite up our moderator for the evening from the Berkeley Forum, Christy Mully.
Thank you so much for that really in-depth discussion. I truly enjoyed listening to it, Dean Elmendorf.
Thank you, Christy.
No problem. So before we start, I'd like to invite the audience to fill out the question form if you haven't done so already. I will be asking your questions at the end of the moderated portion. So now going into our moderated portion for our first question, I'd like to start our discussion based on your earlier career and your contribution towards public policy began before your role as Dean of the Kennedy School, such as through your work at the Federal Reserve Board or through the Brookings Institution. How, if at all, has your approach towards public policy changed after transitioning into education?
That's a great question. I think I've had a chance at the Kennedy School to reflect more on what I saw working and not working in the public policy process in Washington. So, for example, one thing I had seen in Washington was that economists like me, as fond as we are of our training and our tools and our perspective, need to work with people from a variety of different disciplines, different backgrounds in the making of public policy. And now at the Kennedy School, we have a collection of faculty members, of scholars and practitioners with a wide range of backgrounds. And I can see how important that is now to achieving the policy changes that we need to achieve. I think another thing that I realized that I saw in Washington but didn't fully appreciate until I came to the Kennedy School and started thinking about what to teach our students is the importance of the communication process, the importance of listening to people's views, and out of their views weaving a persuasive narrative of what policy should do. My own role in policy making was mostly in doing the economic analysis, but that's only a piece of what it takes. And another very important piece is the political process in the best sense of that word, which is listening to views and then talking to people about what one is trying to achieve. And so at the Kennedy School, what I realize is very important, and what our students understand is important, is that they learn analytic skills, but also learn about communications and negotiation and persuasion and a set of political leadership skills that you need along with analytic tools that you may pick up in school.
And one of the key policy pieces that you touched upon in your address tonight is President Biden's $1.9 trillion recovery and relief package. Now, Democrats in Congress are considering using the process of budget reconciliation to ensure that a simple majority is enough to pass the act. What, if any, are the downsides of using this seemingly efficient process?
Well, budget reconciliation is a rather arcane tool that has become particularly important as the Senate has become almost evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans over the past several years. You can only do one reconciliation bill in a year. So one downside of using the reconciliation process now is that you can't use it again in a month. Now, you may get into next year, these are fiscal years, so there are ways to juggle this, but you can't do it very often. And so you have to make sure you're using it for the thing that you really want to use it for. And for those who don't understand, reconciliation bills pass by a majority rather than requiring the 60 votes that most legislation requires to pass the Senate. If the filibuster were eliminated, then all bills could pass with 50 votes and reconciliation wouldn't seem so special anymore. The special thing is it only requires 50 votes. Another downside of using reconciliation is that only certain kinds of policies can be included in reconciliation bills by the rules of the Senate that establish this reconciliation process. Only policies that are budgetary can be included in a reconciliation bill. And when the last time I checked, the Senate parliamentarian who gets to decide what isn't legit for a budget bill was trying to decide whether raising the minimum wage could be in the budget, a reconciliation bill or not. And so using this tool means that certain kinds of policies by Senate rule can't be included. Minimum wage may or may not turn out to be one of those policies. So the third disadvantage is a question of political perspective. If one is trying to work in a bipartisan way, then trying to push something through with just the 50 votes on your side of the aisle doesn't follow that. My own view is that President Biden is correctly being civil in his engagement with the other party, talking to members of the other party, but is not giving up on his policy goals just in order to achieve bipartisan support. But different people will have different views about how far he and the Democrats should reach out to Republicans and how far the Republicans should be reaching out to Democrats.
And one of the points that you made about the specific recovery and relief package is that politicians could be, quote, more nimble in how they design this package. And you specifically highlight using triggers to determine how much funding is allocated based on key metrics. And actually, this was a similar proposal that the Problem Solvers Caucus released last September, including both boosters and reducers based on key economic metrics. So I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the strengths and weaknesses of having a plan that has this nuance of boosters and reducers as opposed to a lump sum $1.9 trillion package.
Well, so I think most of the arguments are on the side of triggers, which I've done research on. And for example, you could have certain benefits geared to the unemployment rate. And moreover, you could have them geared to the unemployment rate by state. And because in general, we find in economic downturns, and even if it's an overall national downturn, different states will have very different experiences. Some states need much more help than others. And we already collect data and publish data on unemployment rates at the state level. So it's pretty straightforward to write into law changes in unemployment benefits or changes in Medicaid benefits or federal support for Medicaid benefits that relate to unemployment rates. I think the disadvantage is that members of Congress like to think that they're steering the car and they don't really want to put the car on autopilot. They want to be steering it. But I think that I think they're overestimating their ability to respond in a nimble manner.
And one of the key concerns that have arisen during this discussion of the stimulus package is this idea of inflation. And 2 days ago, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell stated that inflation is unlikely to reach high levels this year and argued for keeping interest rates very low, while some have argued for the opposite. What, if any, are your thoughts on inflation rates, especially amidst reports that the US economy is recovering faster than expected?
That's a very important question. There is some risk that in providing big fiscal stimulus now and in the coming year, we will overheat the economy in the sense that the demand for goods and services will get so strong because of the fiscal support, because of pent up savings by households, that demand will be so strong that businesses will feel free to raise their prices by a lot. And that's what produces inflation. What Chairman Powell has said on a number of occasions is that he wouldn't be surprised if there was a one-time boost in prices. We're coming out of a very unusual period. Lots of things could happen. But he said it's very unlikely that that one-time boost would get built into ongoing high inflation. Now, before most of you on this gathering were alive, high inflation was a real problem in the United States. And it became a problem in part because people started to build it into their expectations. And so if you expect the prices will go up, then you want to raise your price. And you're raising your price then causes somebody else to expect their price to go up and they raise their price. So businesses kept raising their prices over and over again. That was a real economic cost, but it was a long time ago. Inflation is run below the Federal Reserve's target of 2% for most of the past few decades. And so at this point, I agree with Chairman Powell that the risk of a sort of cycle of high inflation expectations is a pretty remote risk. And moreover, if that did start to happen, then the Federal Reserve would raise interest rates and slow the economy. And so I think that is a risk, but I don't think it is a reason not to go big. Although, as I said again, my own preference would not be for $1.9 trillion, but I think the risk of inflation is a pretty small one.
And I wanted to transition this conversation a bit towards what you spoke about, creating new opportunities for workers, especially as our economy is evolving in this post-COVID-19 economy. And one of the conversations around this topic is this idea of student loan forgiveness, especially for workers who found themselves attaining college degrees, but unable to find meaningful work that would pay off their loans. Now, President Biden has been pushed to enact student loan forgiveness, and Democratic senators have even specified amounts up to $50,000 in forgiveness of student loans. Were such a policy to pass, what would be the short and long-term economic impacts, if any, do you foresee in the future?
That's a good, hard question. I think there are a lot of Americans, let me start by saying there are a lot of Americans who are struggling to pay student loan debt, who don't have the means to pay what they owe. And for many of those people, the problem is that they took out some debt to get some education, but weren't able to finish the courses or finish a degree, and have not ended up with a job that pays enough for them to then pay off the student loan debt. On average, education is a good investment, but that doesn't mean that it works out for every person. And so there are a lot of people for whom it has not worked out very well, and they're suffering from debts. Relieving their debt burden would enable them to, some cases, buy houses, buy cars, fund their own children's education, to participate more fully in the sorts of material things that many people can enjoy in this country. And so alleviating those debt obligations would provide some spur to economic activity and would help some people who would really benefit from that help. Now, I will say my own view here is that the amount of debt that's forgiven should not be at a very high level, because in fact, most of the people who owe large amounts do so through professional educations that are in fact giving them jobs that enable them to pay off those debts. And so I don't think that it's wrong to conflate the high amount owed to people who are necessarily having the most trouble paying it off. I think in some ways it's actually the opposite, which is it's a large number of people who owe amounts that aren't the largest, but just don't have the means to pay. So I think you can get most of the social and economic advantages of reducing student debt if you still cap the amount that is forgiven. And that's what the debate is about, as you know. The other part of the debate, I should say, is what power the president has through executive orders versus what the Congress needs to legislate. I think in general, there's been an unfortunate trend in the Obama administration to some extent, much worse in the Trump administration, of presidents taking an expansive view of their own powers. I think it would be better if more things had to actually be voted on by the Congress. Even if in individual situations, I might myself much prefer what a president would do to what the congressional vote would be. I think it's just an unfortunate way to run policy, to leave too much of it to individual presidents' discretion. It's another part of the debate here, the debate about the substance of the policy, and then there's a debate about what it is that the president should be able to do. And I'm not a lawyer, so I can't judge what's legal. I'm just saying, as a policy person, I think it's better if we actually hash these things out and vote on them than turning over so much power to whoever is president at a point in time.
And unfortunately, for the sake of time, this is going to be my last question before we move on to audience questions. So a 2020 Prosper Insights and Analytics study states only 33% of Gen Z feels financially stable, which may lead them to pursue opportunities in the private sector rather than those in the public sector. What benefits, if any, come with working in the public sector in spite of potential challenges?
That's a perfect question. I understand that there can be rewards of the private sector that the public sector can't always match. And there can be lots of kinds of rewards of the private sector. But I will say my own life has been spent in the public sector. And I found three great rewards of this. One is that the problems are intellectually really hard and interesting. Trying to design policies to achieve things in our very complicated economy and society is a challenge, and it's an exciting challenge to work on. The second reward that I see is that I've had a chance to work with amazing people. The people who choose to devote their careers or parts of their careers to public service, I've found to be just incredibly nice and interesting and warm and committed people. So I've loved the colleagues I've had in all these different organizations I've worked in. And the third reward is that it is really nice to think at the end of the day, or the end of a week or a month or a year, that one has spent the time serving one's neighbors and fellow Californians or fellow Americans. And that there is a really big psychic reward to knowing that your hard work is going to serve others.
And with that, we'll move on to our audience questions. Our first question from Anonymous asks, what do you think are the effects of the Fed's quantitative easing program and buying of short-term securities?
The effects, thank you for the question. The effects are to hold down interest rates, make loans more easily available to households and businesses, and through that to keep the economy going at a period when the pandemic's effects are causing this huge crunch and are pushing people out of work. So the Fed's policies have been, I think, very, very appropriate and successful. But there are risks in keeping interest rates so low for a long time, and it will be good when the economy is strong enough that the Fed will be able to raise rates again, and to, through that process, to reduce the quantitative easing that it's doing.
And we have another person ask, what are your thoughts on the filibuster and should it be eliminated?
I've thought about that question. I'm not sure what the answer is. I am more tempted now to eliminate the filibuster than I was before, was say a few years ago when I worked for the Congress. And part of that is my frustration that the Congress seems paralyzed on too many occasions. They're getting 60 votes in the Senate is just too high a bar for action. Another part of the change in my thinking is understanding that in some ways there's more incentive for negotiation across the aisle when you don't have that 60 vote threshold. So I just read a story that said, think about the current debate about fiscal policy. Because the reconciliation bill can pass with 50 votes or 51 votes, including the vice president, then the centrists, so people like Senator Manchin on the Democratic side, people like Senator Murkowski on the Republican side, have a lot of power because their vote could be the difference. And that gives them a chance to work together, sometimes across the aisle, and make a difference. Whereas if the threshold for the bill was 60 votes, then Senator Manchin would have no particular power. And because it's so hard to get 60 votes, the power basically goes back to the people on the extremes. Mitch McConnell would have a lot of power of being able to mount 41 votes in opposition. And so I think that the filibuster hinders action and also in some ways actually hinders the sort of bipartisan negotiations that I think would be helpful. So I'm leaning more toward eliminating the filibuster, but I'm not quite there because I think that changes in institutions can have unanticipated consequences. And I don't know enough about political history myself to have confidence that there wouldn't be some pretty big unanticipated consequences of eliminating the filibuster. And I'm trying to learn more about that so I can have a particular view. But that's what I'm wrestling with right now.
And I think we have time for one more audience question. So Andrew asks, over the past year, market trends have generally been bullish, even in light of the pandemic. With Chairman Powell's recent announcement to not raise rates anytime soon and 10-year rates rising, where do you think markets will go from here?
Andrew, I wish I knew. I'm surprised that financial markets have been as ebullient as they have been. I'm a pretty optimistic person, but I feel that the stock market, for example, is building in an assumption of really a strong growth in profits in an but discounting that growth in profits at a low interest rate, which is hard. And I think those things are a little hard to reconcile. And so I'm a little worried about how high stock prices are. But the world is littered with economists' predictions about financial markets that turned out to be wrong. And so you shouldn't put a lot of weight in what I say. The one comment I'll make about interest rates, though, is that I'm not surprised the rates are going up, but they're still really low by the standards of the last few decades. And so I think we should, some increase in rates is natural as the economy gets stronger. But what we saw after the financial crisis and Great Recession was the rates didn't come up very much. They didn't come up to where they'd been before that financial crisis and recession. And so I think rates are rising now naturally, but probably won't rise very far by the standards of the last several decades. And so in that sense, I think fairly low rates are likely to continue, and that will provide ongoing support for stock prices. So I'm not predicting a sort of crash or anything like that, just to be very clear, but I do worry that financial markets are a little too optimistic and about the future, which is still full of short-term risks around the pandemic, but also longer-term risks. It's a big, complicated world, and one shouldn't get too confident in one's outlook for it.
And I think that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Dean Elmendorf, for answering all of our questions. I'd now like to invite our president, Aparna Iyer, back up to the stage for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Christy.
Thank you both so much for that incredible Q&A portion, and a huge virtual round of applause to Christy, our moderator, and to Dean Elmendorf, our speaker for tonight. We really appreciate it. And in fact, as a token of our appreciation, at every single Berkeley Forum event, our communications team designs a custom poster for our speaker, and this one is no exception. So this was designed for you by Sadia Hassan from our communications team.
Thank you, Sadia. This is wonderful. I love it. Can you send me the file with this picture in it?
Yes, absolutely. We can do that. Excuse me. And when we're back and safe in person, we can mail you a physical copy. So I'm sure Wendy can get that out to you. And so before we fully close out, we'd just like to ask whether you have any final closing remarks that you'd like to make to the audience.
I just want to say thank you. This has been a wonderful evening for me, afternoon for you, I guess, I hope. And it's been great to be here. And I look forward to running into you folks in the public policy world in the future. Thank you very much.
I'm glad. Thank you so much. And to our audience, we are going to be having more Berkeley Forum events coming up. So our next event is a panel on universal healthcare, and that'll be next month on the 4th. So look out for that, and it'll be on Facebook Live. Thank you all so much for coming and for spending your evening at the Berkeley Forum. If you'd like to provide feedback or suggest speakers for our upcoming events, you can fill out our feedback form at tinyurl.com/forumfeedbackspring2021. If you'd like to keep up with us, we encourage you to like us on Facebook for all of our information and to visit our website listed here. And lastly, if you are willing and able, we ask that you help support us in any way you can. So our Venmo is right below, and any amount of this goes towards helping us put on more events. So thank you so much for coming to this Berkeley Forum event, and we hope to see you at more.